Welcome to Lesson 3.1, Demography and Health, or Demography and Health, depending on where you live in the world. So the question I ask you is, why is understanding demographic and epidemiological trends useful in addressing global health issues? So what is demography? Well, it's basically the study of human populations, but it's a little bit more than that. It's that statistical study of human populations. And so some of the key things we're going to discuss in this lecture are population growth, population aging, urbanization, the demographic divide, the demographic transition, and epidemiological transition. So first, let's look at population growth. So the last time that we looked at the global population, it was estimated to be 7.6 million in 2018. So we're kind of along here. And it's estimated that if we were to project to 2050 and beyond, you can see the change in the global population to be about 9.9 million, and the majority of the growth is occurring in Africa, so the low middle income, and Asia. So this low to middle income countries, especially sub-Saharan Africa. So let's talk about a couple of reasons why. The first is the decreasing in fertility rates, and I'm going to speak to that on the next slide. But some of the concerns about this growing population in Africa and Asia is for a number of reasons. Remember that, for one thing, a growing population is going to put a significant impact on our environment. Where are we going to find the food? Do we have enough good water? It's going to encroach on other parts of the environment when you have a growing population. The other thing is that, thinking about these areas in Africa and Asia, the growing ability to need a good water supply and sanitation, and that's going to be hard to provide for an increasing population, specifically in those regions. What about healthcare services? These areas already have a very large, limited health services, and are they going to be able to afford to grow their health services? And another thing is for low-income countries to provide education to their growing population. So it's unfortunate that in the areas that have the least resources, they're going to see the biggest population growth. As I alluded to in the last slide about population growth, you'll see in the higher income countries that the fertility rate is actually dropped. And in some countries, it's actually below the population rate. And so think about the concern in our high income countries. Think about Canada. So we have a growing, aging population, but our fertility rate is about 1.8. How are we going to care for our aging population? Will there be enough income generated to care for our aging population? As well, if we look at where the fertility rate is the highest, again, it's highest in our low middle income countries. And so the importance of providing family planning to countries that have this growing population. And again, there's a lot of cultural issues around that we will learn about. So just the importance and the impact that what happens when women or families are having fewer children. So the next point I want to make is about the aging population. So you know from other courses in your program that the population of the world is aging. And we're seeing this significantly in our high-income countries because we have good health care. One of the areas that we're concerned about is this elderly support ratio, in that the number of people that are between 15 to 64 years of age compared to the number of people greater than 64 years of age, and that burden that's going to be on that younger population. You know, other things to consider are the aging population and the shift in the burden of disease and the increase in health expenditures, and how are we going to finance our healthcare services. And so, we worry about that in our high income countries, but think about the health expenditure for those low income countries. So people are living longer, they experience more years with morbidities and disabilities, largely related to non-communicable diseases, and that's going to raise the cost of our health care. So some things to think about when we're thinking about our aging population and demography. So next is urbanization. So we've seen a real shift in the last 15 years of populations moving to urban areas for the first time in history. And so for a lot of times in low middle income countries, individuals would live in the rural settings, but they're moving to the urban centers for a number of reasons. And a big one is for employment. And so think about how that's going to impact our health. So it's going to, first of all, put an enormous pressure on urban centers to grow their infrastructure. So they're going to be growing, and you get that urban sprawl into rural areas. So think about the environment in those areas. It's going to put a big impact on water and sanitation, schools and health services for low middle income countries. And then just think about as cities are becoming urbanized, they're going to have a development of crowded and low standard housing, and that can have negative effects on individuals' health. So because of some of the things we've already discussed in the previous slides, we have something called the demographic divide. And it's the differences between our high income and our low income countries. So highest income countries, as you can see here in Japan, have low fertility, declining populations, but an aging population. And in our lowest income countries, they have high fertility, although it's declining, but a very high growing population. Look at the difference in these populations. And so this is going to lead to, again, the impact on health. So life expectancies are still a really big divide between life expectancy, again, related to health. Infant death rates, you can see the difference here. And so just understanding that there are health disparities, and what is causing these health disparities is not only access to healthcare, it's many other different things that are happening. And so that's one of the things, or a few of the things, that we will discuss in the 12 weeks of this course. I want to spend the next few slides talking about demographic transition. So this is really important to understand as we think about health. So demographic transition is the shift in the pattern of high fertility rates and high mortality rates to low fertility and low mortality. And this typically takes place as a country develops from being a low-income country to a high-income country. And we've seen that when we looked at the graphs between Japan and Nigeria. So why does this happen? So 100 years ago, most populations across the world were all the same, even here in Canada. There was high birth rates, high death rates, short life expectancy, and most people were dying from infections or undernutrition. But as countries developed from the 20th to the 21st century and going from low-income countries to high-income countries, we found that there was this demographic transition. So you've gone from a lower birth rate, you've gone from high birth rates and high death rates and short life expectancies to jump to the 21st century with a decrease in death rate, a decrease in birth rate, and an increase in life expectancy. And this has happened in our high-income countries. Our low-income countries, for the most part, are down here, but we're starting to see a little bit of a transition for these low-income countries. And so why were people dying? Well, disease and death due to infections and undernutrition in the early 20th century, and more so now we're seeing the 21st century. So why the change in health status where we see now our high-income countries are at? Well, improved medical technologies, vaccines, antibiotics, contraceptives, improved living conditions. So again, water and sanitation, better nutrition, improved health systems, Modernization, economic development, so better education, people knew more, economic growth. And you can see how we were able to transition from those earlier stages in the early 20th century to where we are now. And if you look at these 4 points here, you can see this is what we need to focus on for those low-income countries to have them shift to where we are now. So global health statisticians would look at this through something called population pyramids. So let's look at some of these. So if we look at this country here, we can see it's a country that has high fertility rates and high mortality rates. And so this would be probably fairly common in our low income, high fertility countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So you can see the changes here. If we look at the second pyramid down here, we can see that maybe this is a country that their mortality has begun to decline, but their fertility rates remain high. And so this is something that we would see in a country that's undergoing a demographic transition. This pyramid up here is very similar probably to Canada. Now they indicated that it's United States, but this would be similar to Canada. And so it reflects a population in which the fertility has been reduced and the fertility rate is declining, and which there's a large share of the older population than in. So you can see the difference between here and here. We have this larger, older population that are growing here, and our fertility rates are starting to decline. And this one was indicative of very similar to the United States, where you had the fertility rates declining. You had this big jump here in a large growing population, and then it's starting to narrow down here. And in the textbook, they've indicated that this may be countries such as Russia, Japan, or Australia, in which the mortality rates are low and fertility rates are low, and the population shrinks in the absence of maybe immigration. So just some examples of what a statistician would look like when they're looking at demography. The last transition that I want to discuss is epidemiologic transition. And that transition is, what are people dying from? So as a country goes from a developing to a developed country, or a low income to a high income country, what they're dying from shifts. It shifts from infectious communicable diseases to chronic non-communicable diseases. And so first you have the high and fluctuating mortality rates, related to these poor health conditions, epidemics, famines, so nutritious issues, people dying from infectious diseases. And again, as we transition, we have this decline in mortality, people living longer, increased life expectancy, and the predominance of people living with disability, but also dying from those chronic non-communicable diseases. So this is just another example. Mortality rates of what people are dying from. And so we've had this, we have infectious diseases here, where people were dying from infectious diseases and a high mortality rate. And now we have these non-communicable diseases that people are living longer with. And it's more of looking at those DALYs, that the disability adjusted life years, but people are living longer with these chronic diseases. And so we see that change. One thing I want to point out is that many countries, and also we're seeing this within countries and across countries, is that as a country develops from a high burden of disease from infectious diseases to a more non-communicable diseases, some countries are stuck in this double burden of disease. And I'm seeing this loud and clear in my work in Ghana, where we still have high rates of malaria, HIV infections, children dying from diarrhea and cholera, but also coupled with hypertension, diabetes. And so they're exhibiting this double burden of disease, so this coexistence of both infectious diseases and non-communicable diseases. So there has been substantial progress in improving health and raising the life expectancy in really all parts of the world. But these are some of the key factors that we need to consider of what has led to improvements in health. So nutrition, education, the political stability of countries, scientific improvements. Other drivers that have been influencing the change have been the economic development of a country, again, the scientific and technological changes, climate change, political stability, and emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases. And so obviously we've seen this emerging infectious disease, COVID, the impact that COVID has had. Just think about the impact that it's had on high income countries, and we'll talk about the significant impact that it will have on developing countries. And so when you're thinking about global health and how to improve global health, these are all the things that we need to take into consideration, because we know how we as Canada has progressed from the early 19th century to the 21st century. Sorry, the early 20th century to the 21st century. And so we need to invest in those key risk factors and determinants of health that we know impact health. We need to invest in low cost but high impact health services. And what are those? And I'm going to speak to a number of these with my work in Ghana. We need to look at focusing in on those communities and providing good primary health care. What is needed right within those communities? And so just wrapping up some of the main messages, the importance of understanding demographic trends and how it leads to our understanding of how to address key global health issues. We've looked at the importance and the impact of population growth, population aging, and urbanization. Remember, demographic transition is that pattern of movement from high mortality and high fertility to low mortality and low fertility, and the impact that that's going to have on populations. And then lastly, the epidemiologic transition is that movement from a pattern of communicable to non-communicable diseases.